Emma.
Hello.
Let's see if more people show up. We'll hang out for a bit. Okay. All right. Well, I guess we'll just uh, give it 2 more minutes or so, and then we'll start. Okay, so let's see. Um, 1, 2, 1. All right, hold on a second. Hey, shh. You realize what time it is? Okay. So when we were talking before um, about Keynesianism, we mentioned that the response was neoliberalism. Okay, and that started right around the 70s, like the late 70s, right? And it really sort of kicked off in earnest in the 80s, at least in the United States. So like Margaret Thatcher uh, really adopted the idea. She sort of famously, after reading Frederick Hayek, who we'll learn about in just a minute, she took the book, his book, out of our briefcase or whatever, and was like, "This is what we believe," and rearranged the British economy around it, and unfortunately ruined the British economy. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit when we talk about the case of Britain. Um, but and in the United States, initially, you saw a little bit of where it sort of jump started the economy briefly, but then it basically, if you look at this meme, oh, am I still on mute? I'm not on mute, am I? No. Okay, so if you look at this meme, right, this is an actual um, timeline of economic activity in the United States, okay, and of both productivity and wages, right? So you see that things start to go awry in the late 70s a little bit, and it just, by the time the 80s happen, it just really starts to separate, and then it just sort of balloons and takes off, right? And it's supposed to be from an economic theory that your productivity and your wages are supposed to be relatively the same, right? But under neoliberalism, because it encourages this notion that of this reduced role of the government and maximizing efficiency, okay, whatever that means. Um, you have workers, because of things like technology and et cetera, right? Growing technology, they're able to actually produce more, okay? Um, but efficiency for um, employers ends up looking like things like reduced wages, okay? Discouraging unions and things like that. Okay, so uh, the people don't have unions to fight for their rights anymore in relation to economic conditions, right? Because companies are being allowed essentially to break up unions. And you see over the late 70s through today a significant effort to bust up unions, okay, across all sectors. So, by definition, neoliberalism argues government should balance its budget and minimize role in the economy and allow the market to allocate resources to maximize efficiency and thereby economic growth. It rejects Keynesian policy. And again, like I said, it argues for reduced role in the economy. One of the biggest thinkers of neoliberalism is Frederick Hayek, and we'll look at a video about him. Hold on.
Friedrich August von Hayek was a political economist who had a tremendous influence upon how people in capitalist societies understand the concept of liberty. Controversially, for Hayek, liberty did not mean democracy or a commitment to a set of liberal ideals. Rather, Hayek believed that liberty was a policy which deliberately adopts competition, markets, and prices as its ordering principles. To Hayek's way of thinking, it was markets that guaranteed individual liberty, and by contrast, it was the interference of the state in markets which disrupted the operation of liberty and started society down, as he famously put.
Hold on a second. Subtitles. English. Okay, sorry.
The road to serfdom. Hayek was born into a minor part of the Austro-Hungarian aristocracy. His father, who came from a line of scholars, was a medical doctor and a part-time lecturer in botany. Hayek's childhood was filled with considerations of philosophy and economics. After a brief stint in the Austro-Hungarian army during the First World War, Hayek took up studies at the University of Vienna, obtaining doctorates in law and political science, and afterwards he became an academic economist. Hayek's career can be divided into two periods. The first, which ended towards the end of the 1940s, was spent mainly at the London School of Economics, where Hayek concerned himself with many of the macroeconomic debates of the day. The second half of Hayek's career was much more varied. From 1945 onwards, in first Chicago and later Freiburg, Los Angeles, and Salzburg, Hayek wrote and lectured on a whole range of subjects. Economics, yes, but also politics, psychology, philosophy, and the philosophy of science. And while he officially retired in 1968, it was actually in the 1970s and 80s that Hayek enjoyed his greatest moments of influence, being awarded the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 1974 and subsequently being enormously influential upon the governments of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. During Hayek's stay at the London School of Economics, which he joined in 1931, he wrestled with a number of the then contemporary debates within economic theory. Much of this revolved around the business cycle, which, put simply, is the way in which economies grow and contract. Traditional economic theory held that, over time, economies find themselves in equilibrium. In short, gluts and shortages should balance themselves out via market mechanisms, leading to the optimal distribution of resources within an economy. The problem was that the economic peaks and troughs seemed to keep occurring, and they also seemed to be more dramatic than they should be. When the world economy stagnated and then crashed in the late 1920s and the 1930s, fierce debate began as to why this had occurred. Coming at economics from a fairly classical position, Hayek focused on issues of supply. He noticed that when economies were in a recession, central banks often artificially injected more money into the economy by printing cash, or in addition, by holding interest rates low to encourage investment rather than saving. Hayek argued that this was a mistake. When money was too readily available, entrepreneurs invested in products which were not necessarily desired by consumers. When these products went unsold, companies would go bankrupt, leaving industrial capacity invested where it need not be. In addition, cheap credit incentivized long-term capital investment, and Hayek argued that this too was a problem because it limited the possibility of entrepreneurs attempting to realize short-term gains which would actually kickstart the economy. Resisting the temptation to meddle in the money supply was, for Hayek, crucial to solving the problems of the Great Depression. Hayek's colleagues at the London School of Economics were receptive to his more classical approach. But up the road in Cambridge, a very different set of ideas was emerging, centered on the thought of John Maynard Keynes. Keynes argued that the problems of the 1930s economy were located not so much in issues of supply, but rather of demand. For Keynes, the role of government was to invest in public works, the buildings of roads, for example, which would create employment and therefore give people money to spend, stimulating economic growth. For Keynes, full employment was therefore not only a laudable social goal, but vital for the economy too. Keynes's demand-led economics was fundamentally at odds with Hayek's ideas. Hayek felt that Keynes's focus on full employment would require governments to keep increasing money supply. This, in turn, would create severe inflation of the kind that had wiped out his family's savings when 1920s Austria had suffered a bout of hyperinflation. Throughout the 1930s, Hayek and Keynes corresponded with each other, argued bitterly, and found very little common ground. During the Second World War, they even met under bizarre circumstances. Because of the German bombing campaign against London, the LSE had been evacuated to Cambridge. One night, Keynes and Hayek were assigned to fire watch duty together on the roof of the chapel of King's College. Sadly, we don't know what it was they talked about throughout that night. The opening of the second half of Hayek's career is marked by his first foray out from dry economic arguments and the publication of what is probably his most famous work, The Road to Serfdom. Hayek saw the writing of this book as a form of war work, forced upon him because, as a former enemy combatant, Hayek was refused official service in the British war effort. Against the backdrop of Keynes's ideas on planning, which had become accepted within British government circles, The Road to Serfdom was an attempt to save people from themselves, or more accurately, from central government. Hayek put forward several key arguments. Firstly, that there was nothing intrinsic to Germans as a race of people that had caused them to adopt authoritarian forms of government. Hayek rejected the idea, somewhat popular at the time, that there was something about German culture, or indeed inherent to Germans as a race, which predisposed them to authoritarian and expansionist forms of government. Secondly, Hayek argued that where Germany and the Soviet Union, too, for that matter, had gone wrong was in undertaking state planning that interfered in the natural operation of markets. For Hayek, the problem with state planning was that it necessarily involved offering up responsibility for deciding upon a plan to a single individual. In a bureaucratic system such as the state, Hayek argued, someone had to ultimately decide on what course of action should be taken, and that person's judgment would necessarily have to be deferred to, and deferred to repeatedly over a given period of time. In this sense, planning led societies to sleepwalk into dictatorship. Thirdly, not only did Hayek worry about the inherent need for planners to defer to a single individual, but also he was concerned that fundamentally no one individual could actually make rational choices in regards to economic problems, due to them not having enough information to base their decisions upon. To be clear, it was not that Hayek necessarily condemned dictatorship. After all, his vision of liberty was a society in which markets were the principal method of economic organization, not necessarily one where society collectively decided upon governments via the ballot box. To this end, Hayek was comfortable with dictators who adopted free market economic policies involving minimal state intervention in a nation's economy. But dictators who undertook economic planning were, for Hayek, the really great evil. Hayek saw it like this. Markets are extremely complicated networks with millions, if not billions, of transactions going on all the time. Even consideration of some of the basics of market transactions shows this. Items are bought and sold, commodities are invested in and divested from, and famines and bumper crop yields affect how much there is to eat and how much it will cost to acquire it, in keeping with the laws of supply and demand. When individuals make choices as to whether or not to buy a commodity, they affect that commodity's price. If it becomes scarce, its price increases. If it becomes plentiful, its price falls. In this sense, the free market acts as a kind of constant referendum on the value of goods within an economy. For Hayek, the market represented a form of collective agreement made amongst all of the people operating in that market as to the value of particular goods and services. And against the collective wisdom of hundreds or thousands or millions of people, what could one single planner hope to offer that represented a superior form of wisdom? Liberty for Hayek, therefore, was to be found in letting the market do its work. The Road to Serfdom launched Hayek's later career. Instantly, it became a bestseller. During the Second World War, its print run was limited due to paper shortages, and obtaining a copy was nigh on impossible due to sheer demand. In the United States of America, a condensed Reader's Digest version of the book brought the message to a very large public. So too did a series of lectures delivered by Hayek during 1945 at various venues in the United States. Hayek, cold-shouldered by British policymakers and economists, was delighted at the reception he received in the US, and in 1950 he moved to the University of Chicago, which became the center of neoliberal economic thinking, with which Hayek was closely associated, much as Cambridge had been the locus for Keynesian economics. But despite the popular acclaim of The Road to Serfdom, two negative reactions irked him. First of all, some of his own colleagues, normally sympathetic to the ideas he put forward, saw The Road to Serfdom as a kind of lightweight form of journalism rather than as a form of scholarship. Keynes, who read The Road to Serfdom, sent Hayek what was, for the most part, a complimentary message about its content. However, towards the end and in quick order, Keynes challenged Hayek as to where he would draw the line on government planning. Some planning was clearly needed. Hayek was not an economic anarchist after all, but Keynes challenged where would the line be drawn. It took Hayek many years to work out his response to Keynes, who died in 1946, but the response eventually came in 1960 in Hayek's book, The Constitution of Liberty. The book laid out Hayek's practical vision for where the line between the state and the market should be drawn, and it was highly influential among the political right. In an anecdote, a story is told that at a meeting with the Conservative Research Department in 1975, Margaret Thatcher responded to a policy paper on political philosophy by reaching into her handbag and withdrawing a copy of The Constitution of Liberty. Holding it aloft, Thatcher declared, "This is what we believe." As the 20th century unfolded, Hayek's ideas gained more common currency. The notion that the state should limit itself to providing a legal framework within which entrepreneurs can engage with free markets is now at the heart of much of economic thinking. Many politicians and large sections of the public, too, are skeptical about the ability of the state to plan and undertake anything but the most simple of economic tasks. And this owes much to Hayek's warnings about the anti-libertarian perils of planning and the inability of planners to truly understand the world around them. Even when the financial crisis of 2008 hit the world economy, leading to a prolonged recession, faith in government planning was not restored in the popular imagination. This was best testified to by The Road to Serfdom hitting the #1 spot on the Amazon book bestseller list in early 2010, despite it having been written over 60 years ago.
Okay, so okay. So, and what? Oops. Oh, I'm so sorry. Hold on. I have to shut it off. Which one is which? Hold on. Who's this other one?
I'm at Cambridge University, and I'm here to interview.
Okay, so first of all, before I go on, does anybody have any questions between neoliberalism and Keynesianism, like uh, the differences, or do you want to make a comment about any of that? Go ahead. Somebody gonna say something? There's one thing that political scientists consistently have like an issue with in relation to like I mean, there's several, but one of the main things, particularly that political scientists take issue with in relation to Hayek, is that he just consistently does not have a problem with dictators, right? Except wherein they would interfere with the market, right? And so like he would often like defend, like in life, defend Pinochet and, other people like that, because, they were more, free market types, right? Uh, and again, he thought that what mattered first and foremost was the market, versus, these notions of what we perceive as liberal ideas, right? Um, and that's what mattered first and foremost. So, you know, a lot of people take issue with those ideas. And you see that, like if you read like The Road to Serfdom in particular, it's very evident. So before I look at this video, this is like a little chart that would, sort of cover some of the differences, right? For the role of governments, Keynesianism thinks that government should actively manage business cycles. So as, the economy is going into dips, the government should definitely step in and manage that because again, Keynes felt that anytime those dips occurred, um, you know, people suffered, right? And would be suffering. And whereas classical liberalism would say, you just sort of have to wait it out. Um, uh, Keynes would be like, well, people who are going to die in the meantime, right? Or, maybe it'll take so long that, it might be a generation and, you can't wait for that, right? People's lives will be affected. The next generation will be affected by that, right? Um, so government should step in to manage that, right, and to help. Neoliberalism says that governments should just play a very diminished role in the economy. Um, so what that means is just create sort of the legal conditions for companies to operate and then just sort of back off, right? Mostly laissez-faire type economics, right? Hands off type stuff. Key instruments, fiscal policy, including deficit spending, regulations, looser monetary policy, right? So in other words, dropping interest rates as needed, definitely regulating business to create fairer things like working conditions or um, creating, you know, fairer wages and things like that, right? And of course, like we talked about, going into deficit in order to promote works programs and stuff like that, right? Um, neoliberals focus on monetary policy, deregulation, and privatization. So they want to get rid of as many of the uh, regulations surrounding business. They want to focus on things like uh, um, privatization of industry, that sort of thing, right? So the problem is when you deregulate businesses, to some extent it can be beneficial, but at the same time, you have circumstances where it encourages, things like destructions of unions and lower wages and stagnation of wages. And it encourages businesses to, go offshore, go to third world countries where they can, predate on the local economies there and exploit those economies and things like that, and those people. So it's not necessarily the greatest thing ever, right? Um, and criticisms, oops, I'm sorry. Deficit spending that reduces private investment and growth and causes inflation, regulation, limits business investment. So kind of like what I was just saying a minute ago, that when you regulate, that some people feel like when you do these regulations that it's going to limit a business's ability to grow. It's going to reduce their ability to then go and invest back into their business and that kind of thing, because they will have less money because they're going to have to spend money on various regulations and things like this, right? um, and but neoliberalism, criticism, restrictions on government spending, slow growth during recession, deregulation creates boom and bust and increases inequality. So uh, neoliberalism, the critiques of that is that you have much more volatility in the market. You're going to have more booms and busts that occur, and you're going to oh, yeah. So, and during recessions, um, because the focus is on things like austerity, not spending money and stuff like that, it's much more difficult to recover during those recessions um, than it would be under a Keynesian model. Okay, so before we go on, I want to show you this one video. It's with a famous economist, um, Han Shang. He's a very, very famous dude.
A well-respected economist called Dr. Hajin Chang. He's the guy who wrote this book, plugging his book for him. Should get that well. 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism. Massive bestseller. And the reason I'm doing that is because what I want this channel to be is a kind of alternative ways of looking at the world, and I want to challenge the status quo and what we're told on a daily basis. And he's ideal for doing this because we're going to do in this interview is kind of slice some myths, well he will, and just show that the way the economy is run and the way we're told it should run, well, actually it doesn't have to be like this. Surely austerity is necessary. If you have a situation where the government is spending more than it's getting back through taxation, then it has to balance the books. That's not ideological, that's just a fact.
The best way to defend a politically biased...
I forgot. Nisha, hold on. First of all, obviously, this is in England, and so some of the things that they talk about are going to be more relevant towards England. However, it's important to remember that England is still a liberal democracy, and so keep in mind that it would still be it would still work, okay, in relation to the United States. Okay. Hold on, let me just back this up just a little bit. Resume here. Why is sharing pause? Can you guys see my screen? Can you see the video?
It's just kind of a white screen.
Oh,
Yeah, it's like a blank screen right now.
sharing is paused. Bring your shared window to the front. Hold on. Hold on. Now, let me just try sharing again. Hold on. Zoom. Meeting. Start share. Okay, can you see it now? Can you guys see the video now?
Yeah. I can see the screen now.
Okay, great. All right, sorry about that. Okay.
Surely austerity is necessary. If you have a situation where the government is spending more than it's getting back through taxation, then it has to balance the books. That's not ideological, that's just a fact.
The best way to defend a politically biased policy is to say that this is all matter of accounting and science. Objectively speaking, there's no need for Britain to run austerity program for 5 years, 6 years. When George Osborne first pushed for this, the excuse was that we don't want to become second Greece. Which is an absolutely ridiculous analogy.
Are you saying he was telling some sort of porky there?
Well, yes, if you want to put it that way, yes.
In terms of Britain's deficit and the economic situation Britain found itself back in 2010, what could a government have done differently?
When you have national debt and try to cut it, you are actually reducing demand in the economy, which then reduces the national output because firms cannot sell enough. And then your GDP might be shrinking, or at least shrinking faster than your debt is shrinking. This is why Greece, after 5 years of austerity, still has more public debt as a proportion of national output than before. Actually, the cutting deficit, the economic downturn can be a self-defeating strategy. The government actually can put a brake on that downward spiral by spending more than it gets in tax revenue. Balancing the books was not really what was behind this austerity policy. It was an attempt to undermine the welfare state, rewrite the social contract, and re-engineer the British economy in the image of American free market system.
Do you think it's fair to say we live in a society where it's socialism for the rich, capitalism for the poor? And if we are, I don't know, dominated by corporate freeloaders, in what sense are we?
I'm afraid that Britons are becoming more and more like that. And, for example, people criticize all these, freeloaders who sit on their backs and don't do anything, collect welfare payments. However, that in terms of the free money they are getting, British corporations are actually getting far more than these welfare recipients.
In what way then? What do big companies get from the state?
We have a situation where ordinary taxpayers are subsidizing the corporations that pay wages that make it impossible for people to live a kind of sustainable life.
In-work benefits.
Exactly, in-work benefit. The benefit system was basically set up on the assumption that when people work, they'll be able to get decent amount of money. Now you have a situation where all these corporations that pay not even minimum wages or just above minimum wage, which is set at a very low level. And people, unless they are subsidized by the state, cannot make ends meet. So that they are getting subsidized massively for paying low wages. They also benefit a lot from state investment in infrastructure, in education, in research and development. But then they say, well, when it comes to paying taxes, it's our choice. It's an option. We will set up a paper company in the Cayman Islands and shift all the profits there. And we have come to take this for granted. This is outrageous. Thinking about these tax havens, I mean, they are the easiest things to deal with. Just imagine 10 most powerful countries declare that from tomorrow, any transaction that involves these designated tax havens will be considered illegal. They'll disappear. The worrying thing is that so many people have been almost brainwashed into accepting this, that the governments are the enemies of business, and business people are the wealth creators, who shouldn't be constrained. If they don't want to pay taxes, that's their choice. This is the most unacceptable thing that we have come to take for granted, and we have to change this.
Taxation is theft. I bet you a lot of people on this video channel, that's what they're going to argue below the line. So what do you say to that?
People who say that taxation is theft have this view that they have created their wealth on their own. Now, this the view of taxation might be to an extent justifiable if we lived in the 16th century where everyone was a subsistence farmer, more or less. But today, in order to create wealth, you need a whole range of public support. You need the legal system, you need government investment in research and development and science. You need government investment in the infrastructure, government investment in education and worker training. And you are creating your wealth using all this. So what you have created is actually a joint production of your own entrepreneurial skill or labor or whatever you have put in there with contribution from the whole society. So saying that this is theft actually is saying that I'm going to steal the public bits, as if it is mine.
When people make the case for public ownership of utilities and services, there's an easy response. Go back to the 1970s. Nationalization is inefficient.
I'm not one of those people who insist on public ownership of these essential services. If you regulate them well, you can get all the benefits of public ownership without actually having public ownership. I mean, Japanese railways is a great example. Wherever you look at, I mean, water, railways, telecommunications, gas, I mean, the prices in this country are so high. I mean, this country's railway is unreliable, not punctual enough.
Very expensive.
Very expensive. Privatization of all these essential services, where market competition really doesn't work, because when you have just one line of the rail, you cannot have many companies competing for that. Yeah? I mean, even fairly mainstream economies would accept that these are industries where public ownership or very strict regulation is necessary because the market competition mechanism doesn't work. Yeah?
The welfare state, its critics argue that it's bloated, that we can't afford it anymore in its current form, and that it's basically subsidizing fecklessness, laziness, the work shy.
There's one thing I would agree in that statement. I mean, the current welfare state needs reform because it was designed in the 1950s and 60s. Today we have a different situation. You know, the people live for another 25, 30 years after they retire. You know, they put the greater burden on the healthcare system. There are fewer younger people to pay for this. So yes, I mean, we might need some readjustment of the welfare system as a whole. But there's really no evidence that the welfare state actually encourages the idle lifestyle. Actually, people who say that, have they tried to live on the kind of money that benefit claimants get? People have stopped seeing the welfare state as a collective social insurance scheme. This kind of collective insurance scheme actually gives that stability in people's lives and make people more accepting of changes. I mean, for example, in countries like Sweden and Finland, the workers are much more willing, they may not prefer it, but are much more willing to accept the corporate restructuring because they know that it's not the end of the world. Yeah? In countries where the welfare is weak, actually workers become very resistant to changes. I mean, the United States is the best example. Yeah? I mean, of course, 90% of US workers are not unionized and they have very little political power. But insofar as you have unionized labor, these people will, of course, resist changes to death because, well, if you lose your job, you cannot even go to a hospital.
Inequality, what's the problem with it? I mean, as long as poorer people, end up better off, why does it matter if there's a gap between the poorer and richer sections of society?
I find it very curious because free market economists say, oh, you know, greed is a part of human nature, yeah? So you shouldn't constrain it. Yeah? But when people talk about inequality, they say, oh, that's envy. That's not a good thing. Yeah. Well, I thought you are supporting letting human nature have its free reign. Yeah. So this is a very disingenuous argument. You know, the problem is that we are social beings, and when you have this disparities in society, which, of course, in theory may be purely the result of individual productivity, but in fact, it's not. Yeah, we know that. Yeah, even if it were purely the result of productivity differential, you know, we cannot run a society with a sense of solidarity, sense of belonging, sense of community. Yeah? And when a society becomes very unequal, you actually begin to see a disintegration of the society because the rich and the poor don't live in the same world anymore. I mean, they may live in the same legal entity called the United Kingdom, but it's as if one group live in the 22nd century, another group that are still working in some kind of Victorian workhouse. Yeah? Another is lack of social mobility. Yeah?
Neoliberalism. This is a term you often hear bandied around to describe the kind of economic system that now dominates in Britain and much of the Western world. So succinctly, how do you define what is neoliberalism?
The 21st century version of liberalism, which is the economic doctrine that ruled Europe and North America in the 18th, 19th century. So for these people, the most important freedom, liberty, was liberty of property ownership and its use for its owner's benefit. Until the 19th century, the liberals were actually against democracy. Because these people believe that, well, if you give votes to poor people, they will vote in a government that restricts our freedom to use our property, which will destroy the free market economy. Neoliberalism is the 20th century reinvention of this old doctrine. They had to accept democracy, but they want a democracy that is neutered in the interest of property owners. So they want independent central bank so that the parliament cannot put pressure on the central bank to control monetary policy for the interest of the greater majority. They want independent commission for regulating utilities so that these people don't have to bow to the politicians.
It's often the case, I suppose, that the illusion of every era is that the way things are now are the way things will always be. But do you think the kind of economic system, prevailing order of things, do you think that one day will give way to something else?
100 years ago, this country and other countries put women in prison for asking for vote. 50, 60 years ago, all the founding fathers of the developing nations today were hunted down by the British and the French as terrorists. Only 25 years ago, Margaret Thatcher is supposed to have said that anyone who thinks that there'll be a black majority rule in South Africa lives in a cloud cuckoo land. But all of these things have happened. They don't give it to you. But if enough people fight for these things that once looked impossible can happen. However, I live by the saying of Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist, who said that you need pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will. So yes, we have to accept that the current situation might look rather grim, but we have to keep fighting for a better world. And I'm sure one day it will come. Maybe not in my lifetime, but I'm sure it will come.
You see, there is a different way of looking at it, and I think he's,
All right. So hold on. All right. Does anybody have any thoughts, questions, comments about any of that? Oh. Okay, so now there are multiple types of capitalist economies. Okay, you have the varieties of capitalist. This is the VOCs, or varieties of capitalism, I'm sorry, VOCs. That's a school of thought analyzing wealthy market economies that focus primarily on business firms and how they are governed. And so basically there are two main types. Okay, you have the LMEs, which are liberal market economies, and the CMEs, which are coordinated market economies. Okay, so liberal market economies, by definition, rely heavily on market relationships to govern economic activity. For example, the United States and the United Kingdom. And coordinated market economies, by definition, are firms, financiers, unions, and government consciously coordinate their actions via interlocking ownership and participation, for example, in Germany and Japan. So basically you have, like in LMEs, just real briefly, and we'll go over some like case studies in a few minutes, but like in liberal market economies, they tend to focus on highly mobile, as they call it, workforce, which can be beneficial for things like innovation, though can be highly volatile at the same time. They don't focus a lot on worker retention because they tend to expect that workers will do things like, constantly look for the job with the highest pay. And so, they don't put a lot of investment typically in their workers. They expect that, as such, they expect that workers will gain whatever skills they need to do whatever it is that they want to do on their own, okay, and that the state will play a minimum role in all of that. okay, and that the states will also play a limited role in sort of regulating and interfering with the activity of those different corporations, et cetera, okay? Whereas in like a coordinated market economy, you have these different groups, companies, et cetera. They are basically the inverse, okay? They invest a great deal in their workers, right? So it starts actually with the state. The state will invest a significant amount in training workers, okay, for specific fields. And then once they graduate at whatever level, right, um, different corporations try to basically compete for workers. And so they try to offer highly competitive like benefit packages and things like this, which you don't see in LMEs, right? With pensions and, really great, uh, just stuff like that, right? Because in like Germany, you have national healthcare insurance. And so they, include stuff like that to help with that and blah, blah, blah. And, um, you know, what is it? What else? Oh, and they also invest in like continuing education for you, right? So if you need any like additional training or anything like that, as say technology changes and that kind of thing, they put you through all of that. Like if you need another degree or anything like that, they will pay for all of that for you. Um, and they work together with unions, right, to negotiate pay and stuff like that, right? So they're very, and they work together with government, and like I said, in that regard. And you'll see circumstances. Well, we'll talk about it when we get to Germany. Um, but it's really a unique circumstance. Okay. Globalization. This, by definition, is a rapid increase in the flow of economic activity, technology, and communication around the globe, and the increased sharing of cultural symbols, political ideas, and the movements across countries. So, one question that we ask when we're thinking about globalization is it causing the end of the nation state, right? And we wonder that because, it's like, um, is the interconnectedness between different countries, sometimes it's cities, right? So, like New York City is considered, like a globalized city, right? And a global city, an international city, right? Miami, Los Angeles, right? Chicago, Hong Kong, Moscow, London, all these like really major metropolitan areas, like even like Mexico City, Toronto, um, what else can I think of? Um, Paris, obviously, where there's like a lot of potential economic and activity that would occur, right? Business type stuff, trade, or whatever, ports, wherever you have ports and stuff like that, things that might come in, or could just be like international trade, like monetary trade or things like that, right? So from the level of the city. But when you have that kind of interconnectedness, right, is the state itself starting to wither away? Are the borders withering away? Especially when you consider that sometimes cities might have their own specific connections, say with other countries, that are different than the state, right? Like, what does that mean? And what are the implications, right? So that's one thing that we kind of think about. What are your thoughts, guys, on that? Do you think that there's going to be in the future a diminishing role of the state, where we'll be more of a global community? Blurring of borders and things like that. Anyone have any thoughts?
Maybe in like 100 years, but not for now.
Yeah. Okay. And why do you think not now?
I think that there are a lot of security issues in the world, and like inequality, and like not everybody loves each other.
Right.
So if China and Russia would get on board, maybe then.
Uh-huh.
I don't know. I don't know about like for the next 20 years.
Right, right. Okay. Anybody else have any thoughts? Thanks, Josh. Anyone else? All right. Yeah, I mean, it's a tough one, you know. So at least, you know, nation states aren't going anywhere for the immediate future, right? But we do see that some things are reducing the need for states in some ways. So technology enables globalization through reduced communication and transportation costs, right? So think about it. Like, you can shrink time and space right now, right? Whereas, say, 100 years ago, using Yasha's number, right? 100 years ago, we go back, um, you know, it was much harder to do international travel, right? I mean, you would have to get on a ship, and then the planning to do all of that, right? Say you lived in Nebraska, right? And you wanted to go on like some international tour, you know, across Europe, and then, you know, maybe go on the Orient Express, you know, and then come back, like literally do a world tour. Say you were this like fabulous bajillionaire, you know, in those 100-year ago terms, right? And that's what you wanted to do, but you lived in Nebraska. Okay. So of course you could afford it, right? But the planning would be immense, right? You couldn't just hop on your computer like you do now, look for, you know, go on orbits or whatever, right? And then buy the tickets, and then, you know, with the passport, you know, just go through the consulates and get the various visas you might need and send away for them, and, you know, blah, 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 you know, or just pay a, you know, a travel agent to do all that for you, right? It was much more complicated. You know, you had to um, plan getting horses together, right, to travel from like Nebraska to New York, because that was the main port, right, for international travel. Okay. And then, like, and that takes weeks, okay, upon weeks to travel from Nebraska to New York by, you know, by carriage. Okay. And you didn't just have simple little luggage. If you're going to go for that time, you have trunks. Okay. That's cumbersome, right? And, you know, just all of that planning. And then traveling by ship is, you know, especially back then, just difficult, right? And then across Europe, you'd be also traveling by, by either train, some parts of it you might do by carriage or whatever, depending upon, the circumstance. And arranging all of that is just very difficult, right? And if you go back even further, just going from, say, London to Edinburgh, right, in Scotland was incredibly difficult, right? And just imagine for the average person, trying to arrange horses and doing all of that. It's just so cumbersome and it takes so much time. It'd be like days to make that kind of a trip, okay, by horse. And so distance seems so much further, right? And going back to the international travel idea, it's like this concept of people around the world, right? Time zones were created for the purpose of train travel, right? But most people didn't really have a concept of what it meant. Okay, it's like, what time is, my watch is dead. It's 12:07 right now, here for us in Tampa, and that means it's like 8:07 in Moscow, like people weren't, you don't think of those kinds of things. And what does it mean? Like, I've got to do business with somebody in Moscow. So, it's 8:00 there. They've already had dinner, what are they doing now? Can I get a hold of them? That kind of thing. Are they in the office? Or if I have their personal cell, will I be able to contact them? You know what I mean? Like, it's so different now. So we've been able to shrink time and space because of technology. Right now, I can hop on a plane, get to New York in a couple of hours, and then from there, with a one-way trip to Moscow, get to Moscow, give or take about 10 hours, right? And that's it. Before, a trip like that would have been just months, and I can plan it today and be there next week, or even a couple of days from now if I really needed to, but that's just unthinkable before, right? And so these are the kinds of things that globalization has been able to do, right? And of course, it reduces transportation costs, right? Because it's accessible to everyone now, not just the rich, right? So government policies and shift to neoliberal economic policies reduced government's role in regulating economic transactions, especially across borders. So when governments got out of regulating economic activity, across borders, there were some positives to that, okay? But there was also some negatives, right? Some positives might be that, business travelers or people conducting business might be able to, go between different locations easier. It might cost them less to do business across countries or whatever. But there can also be negatives, like I said. So, for example, we can think of, there is this like Chiquita banana, I think in the 80s, 70s, 80s. Gosh, which island was it that they went to? I forget. I think in Central America. Or was it South America? I can't even remember right now. I had it and I just lost it. Anyway, the point is that they took operations and because of the massive deregulation, because of neoliberalism, they were able to move and go to find another place that you know, the government of that particular country enticed them by not paying taxes, by, you know, basically being able to have the run of the island, right? But what happened was on that island previously, before Chiquita Banana had gotten there were already banana plantations. And when I say that, I don't mean with slave labor. I mean like little, I shouldn't really say plantations, people who had their own banana plots, you know, poor people, okay, who had been selling the bananas like to Chiquita and other people, right? And what happened was Chiquita Banana comes in and they force the people off the land because basically, and the government wasn't going to protect the people, okay? They purchase all the land by force, all right, for pennies on the dollar of what they were worth. Less than pennies on the dollar, really. And put all those people out of business and force them to work for Chiquita Banana, right? And say, if you know, if you want to work, you got to work for us. But then they go, and their working conditions were horrific. So you can again think of like Gilded Age America, right? Where if you get sick, or if you get sick, sorry, allergies, or if you get sick, they, you know, you can lose your job. You can't take sick days. Doesn't matter how sick you are. You know, if you get hurt on the job, you can get fired. There's no workman's comp. All of that kind of stuff. And of course, they're paying starvation wages, and all of that. It was really horrible exploitation. And at the same time, the government was getting kickbacks from Chiquita Banana for this arrangement, right? It was just really horrific exploitation. And then it was exposed, and they had to change some of their working conditions. And you see similar situations with like Hershey chocolate, using child labor and stuff like that too. So it's just really, these are the downsides, and they're pretty big downsides, right, of reduced government role. That's the nice way to put it, right? Where it looks like, you know, the government is just doing this hands-off thing. But what results is you have these corporations who are then exploiting working people in other countries, right? In ways that Americans would never tolerate, right? And it's truly slave labor. Sometimes people are getting beaten, stuff like that. It's really, really horrific. You know, it doesn't matter if you got cancer or whatever, you can't miss a day, you know, because somebody else is very willing to take your job and you need it to put food on the table. You got kids or whatever, you know, and sometimes it's not even enough to put food on the table, but it might buy a little bit of rice, and that's something, you know. It's just terrible, terrible. Political responses to globalization. Individual states are still important in the global market, and expanded capital mobility, but global problems require global solutions. So what they're saying is that, you know, states, they still matter, and they help in terms of people being able to move your capital, your net worth, whatever, between different states or whatever, right? But of course, we all have global problems. We're living in a global problem right now. Okay, a global pandemic, right? So, but when you're talking about worker problems or anything like that, transnational citizens groups pressuring the World Trade Organization or the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, or it could be the World Health Organization, to address global problems, right? Growth of populist far-right parties and movements in Europe and the United States. So we'll talk about the first one. So for example, in response to these neoliberal policies, which really sort of deregulated the global economy, right, through these, and helped really create and spur the growth of these transnational corporations, where we saw, that little meme where the economic situation where you have higher productivity and wages just sort of stagnating. That's also, excuse me, there's a similar chart of income inequality where you have because like in the 50s and 60s, when America was in its golden age, right? I'm so sorry. We had lower income inequality. Now, it's important to understand that, again, we're not talking about no income inequality, right? There's still poor people in the 50s and 60s. We're talking about reduced income inequality, where, you could have a single income home where, people were making living wages, right? You had a pension, you had benefits, you had, you were able to afford like a vacation once a year with your family. You were able to, you were able to afford to go to the doctor. You were able to afford a car, a decent house, right? Your kids had clothes, you had presents under the tree, all that stuff, right? 2.5 kids, a picket fence, right? For the most part, for most people, of course, unless you were a person of color, but I digress. It was much harder for, if you were a person of color in certain circumstances, okay, particularly if you were in the inner city. But anyway, because you always made less than white people, always. But, people could afford things. But anyway, that broke off with neoliberalism, right? With the deregulation of unions, of corporations, so they could grow again into like monopolies and transnational corporations and blah, 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 and stuff like this, right? And so you got situations where, for example, like steel and other big industries would leave the country, right? So this is why we had, for example, like Detroit really fell because it was a center for, the automobile industry, right? And so when steel was deregulated and they were able to go get steel, say like Russia was one of the places they got it. And it was cheaper for them to get it, in Russia and then to make cars in other countries and stuff like that. Then that became a problem, obviously. So Milwaukee was another place where they were making cars. Those two cities just really collapsed as a result of that, right? And so, it wasn't just steel. You have in Mexico, because of NAFTA, the indigenous people were being forced off of farmland and stuff like that. They were a really good example of this because they got together and they sort of fought back, right? And they demanded, that the world sort of pay attention. And this was in the 90s, right? Early 90s. And so they, um, asked the world to, come there and help them, people of conscience to come there and to protest with them because, corporations were trying to push them off their land that the Mexican government had promised to them as being protected native land, right? And, it worked temporarily, at least for a while anyway. They're trying to do it again. But this was where you saw one of the first times you really saw people from around the world sort of come together and, actually travel to, a location in a different part of the world for the purpose of standing up for other people, right? So people acting to try to solve this problem, right? Which they saw not just as a problem for the Mexican natives, but as a growing problem around the world for workers around the world, right? And so they saw this as a sense of solidarity, not just for workers, but also native populations around the world, et cetera, right? And as a response to this, they created something called the World. Hold on, why am I? Hold on. Why can't I think? I can't think. World. I'll have to look it up and tell you later. But anyway, it's this group. It's a international organization that is. Can't believe I forgot this. That is parallel to like the United Nations, and they created it because they felt that the um, the United Nations was not helping to solve these various problems. The IMF, all of these organizations were not really doing an effective job on behalf of the people in these various countries to solve this, right? So it grew up as a parallel organization for people from around the world to come together and meet once a year to try to talk about the issues that were going on in various countries. So they would have representatives from various countries come and meet. World something. Yeah, World Social Forum. Okay. And so they would have people come together and meet. And then what they would do is, again, because of the success of the mestizos in Mexico, they learned that, organizing a certain way was successful, right? And so they would train, they'd have certain like breakout groups that would train people in like protesting and how to organize effectively and to take those skills back home where they could use them to help try to affect change in their local communities, right? And so it was a way to try to help for like social movements, right? So it was a way for them to try to address these problems around the globe, right? And so they were like instrumental in helping with like the Battle of Seattle, which occurred around globalization. Some of those people, some people from Occupy were also involved in the World Social Forum. So like different movements, sometimes people will go to, the World Social Forum for purposes of, trying to talk through these global problems and finding ways to try to, create movements or to, figure out ways to solve them together. Now, we also had this other response to globalization that was not positive, right? And that was the growth of populist far-right parties, okay? Some people don't like change, right? And they see the integration, like, for example, like when like, different countries entering the European Union don't like it when some people don't like entering the European Union, or don't want to enter the European Union. Some people don't want to, right, that are members of certain countries. Some people don't like the European Union because they see it as a threat to their sovereignty. And, kind of like some people don't like, these trade agreements like NAFTA or whatever the new one is now whatever. They see it as a threat to sovereignty, right? And then they also look at things like immigration as a threat to national identity, right? And it gets pretty scary. And so this is how you have, circumstances like in Germany, the rise of the ADF, which is this political party, this far-right party. And, they're particularly racist, and they are very anti-Muslim, for example. And they have done a lot to stir disinformation and try to play on people's fears in relation to immigration that occurred as a result of, the Syrian civil war and various things like that, right? And you have the rise of other far-right parties in Europe as well. In Poland, it's I've written articles about this. I'm sorry, I'm just not feeling very well right now. The justice, I can't believe I can't, hold on a second. I'm so sorry. Just so clogged right now. Look at my article I just wrote. Law and Justice, the Law and Justice Party. I'm sorry. The Law and Justice Party. So they are also very anti-immigration. And it is just so strange because, particularly in Poland, because like I talked about before, they were, the sort of shining example of post-communist USSR, of democracy, right, of inclusion, of, they got this thing right. But, this party played on the fears of the people in relation to immigration. And it's really unfortunate. And so you see this going across Europe, Hungary as well, and in Germany again. It's just so strange and so unfortunate. You're seeing too lots of anti-Jewish crimes and anti-Muslim crimes, and just it's just really really terrifying. You see a rise of Nazism again in Germany. Like, how how is this happening, right? I mean, they know what that leads to, right? And the state is doing what it can. Some laws had been relaxed because I guess they figured, that they had educated the people sufficiently, but apparently not. So they're trying to grapple with that now. Globalization in the European Union. So Brexit, Britain's referendum to leave the EU, that's also viewed as a backlash against globalization. It's really kind of funny because you see in that particular circumstance, people are trying to talk about that they want, again, their sovereignty returned to them in relation to, vis-a-vis the EU, that they feel like they need to have sovereignty over their currency, over, their various laws, etc. And they often will try to say that it's not racist or anything. But when you drill down into it, it really is, because, when you talk to people afterwards who are, say, business owners, like, say, for example, like fishers, or, people like fishermen, or, people like that who have their own businesses, and suddenly they realize that they're going to be affected by these tariffs now because England is now no longer part of the EU. So that means they're going to be dealt with as a separate country. They're going to be subject to tariffs and these various things, right? And so that means that the price of their goods are going to go up and stuff like that. And you point these things out to them and they're like, oh, well, I hadn't thought about that. Right? And it's like, what do you mean you didn't think? Well, what were you thinking about then? Right? And, when you talk to people and you really talk to them, then, they start saying, well, in England, when you go to the restaurants, you don't, it's mostly like people from Southeast Asia or whatever that are like taking your order. Like, you don't see a lot of Britons anymore, right? And it's like, okay, I guess maybe that depends on where you're at, maybe. But, so it's this sense of identity, really, that what it's about. Okay, it's about race in a lot of instances. People have a hard time admitting it, but when it drills down to it, that's tends to be what it's about these open borders. Okay, and immigration. So European Central Bank controls money supply and monetary policy for states using the euro, but each state controls its own fiscal policy, right? So some people were complaining about that in England, for example, right? But really, even though that's the case, everybody has the euro. The European Union doesn't set Britain's fiscal policy. Britain does, right? So to try to say that you know, the European Union had some control over it was false. That wasn't the case. Okay. For example, this was important in the Euro crisis, okay, and the Greek debt crisis. So state responses to globalization. Deindustrialization is the largest economic effect of globalization in wealthy countries. So what that means, and we saw this again, I was talking about that a little bit in relation to the United States, that's where you sort of deindustrialize your own country, right? So like in our country, one of our biggest industrial centers was steel, and we did that, and it was the same in Britain, right? So they had a major problem just like we did, right? And it really affected the British economy, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Convergence. This is an argument that globalization will force these similar economic policies across all countries, okay? So, because if they don't, then other countries will lag behind and die, okay? So then you have comparative institutional advantage. This is a VOC theory, varieties of capitalism theory, and it states that different kinds of capitalist systems have different institutional advantages that they try to maintain, resulting in different responses to globalization. Okay, and we'll talk more about that in a minute, so hold that thought. So the United States. So the United States, again, is an LME, or actually, you know what, it's 1138. I'll talk about these case studies next time, and then we'll go on to the next one. Okay, does anybody have any questions?
I had just like a quick side question. Like, did you happen to get my email yesterday? It was just like about the quiz. Last time we had class, like my internet wasn't really working.
Oh, do you need it reset or something?
Yeah.
Okay.
And like,
okay.
but it was technically like late on Blackboard.
Oh.
I was just wondering if that was like, it could still be counted.
Oh yeah, like I said, like, is that the only problem, that it's late?
Yeah. That was it.
Oh, yeah, don't worry about it, because like I said, I'm just giving you a random date just to kind of help you remember that it's due, you know what I mean? But I just said just before the end of the semester. All right, like just don't even worry. Okay.
Yeah, because like I had thought, like I remember you said something like that, but then I saw the thing come up on my phone. It was like late or whatever, and I was like, oh crap, like I didn't know there was a thing, but no, that's cool though.
Yeah, don't worry about it. So this weekend I'll put the other ones up, and again, you'll just have whenever to do them, so just don't worry about it. And you know, over the next week or so to do them, and that's pretty much it.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
All right, no problem. Anybody else have any questions? Okay, so with that, I'll say goodbye. And if you can think of any other questions you might have, feel free to email me, and I will talk to you guys later. Okay. Bye. Sorry about my allergies.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, bye-bye. No problem, Aubrey. Have a good day. Bye, everybody.